Hello, everyone, and welcome to Norway during World War I, 1914 to 1918. This is a kind of forgotten period during Norwegian history. We pay a lot of attention to the events in 1905, and then again a lot of attention to the events in 1940, and the period between gets forgotten, and that's the subject of this and the next lesson. Let's talk a little about World War I. World War I happens largely because of the great powers' arms race. Well, there are two ideas there. Who were the great powers, and what was their arms race? Let's look at the great powers. The great powers that were involved in World War I were divided into two camps, the Allied powers and the Central powers. The Allied powers were France, Italy, Russia, and England. And then much later in the war, they're joined by the United States. And the rest of the green on the map is pretty much the British Empire. And they all fought on the Allied powers side. On the Central powers side, from the north, we see Germany, Austria-Hungary, which were in union, and then the Ottoman Empire, which was ruled from Istanbul, goes all the way down the coast of Saudi Arabia. And the other yellow parts are German colonies in Africa and German New Guinea in the South Pacific. So those are the two groups that are going to fight this war out. Now, in part, the war happened because of three men who happened to be cousins. The first of those cousins was Kaiser Wilhelm II. He was the ruler of Germany. His cousin was Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, and their cousin was King George V of England. Those boys were all the grandsons of this woman, Victoria, Queen of England, from 1837 to 1901. So Victoria's children had married into every royal family in Europe, and those boys were first cousins, and they did not like each other particularly, and they were very competitive. And like all boys, they competed with their toys. And the first toys they competed with were these things. This is a class of battleship that the English began to build at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, called the Dreadnought class of battleships. These were an incredibly expensive capital investment. They were steel-hulled, meaning the hulls of the ships were made with steel of very great thickness, up to 18 inches thick. So 18 inches is about 30 centimeters thick on the outside. They had thick steel armored hulls. They were powered by steam turbines instead of boilers and reciprocating engines. And they had rapidly firing artillery pieces and large caliber artillery pieces, 8 to 12 inch artillery on them in those turrets on the front of the ship. Compare that with the weapon that you saw at the Cannon Museum, which is a 15-inch. These are slightly smaller, but they're also a generation older. Well, the English start to build their dreadnoughts. The Germans are not far behind. They also begin to build their class of dreadnoughts. And the Russians are not far behind. They begin to build a class of dreadnought ships. The Japanese join into the game later on. And the Americans also build their own class of dreadnoughts. Now, each of those ships has a tremendous amount of steel and stainless steel and armored steel and copper and lots of the raw materials that were used in these ships existed here in Norway and in Scandinavia. So there's a huge market in supplying the raw materials that go into those ships. That's in part of the arms race. The other part of the arms race, let's talk a little about the steam turbine engine that's in each of those ships. They were very high-tech items for the time. They're like a turbine engine on a jet plane that we see today. And if you look in the end of a jet plane, you see what looks like fans. And in these engines, what you see are something called the impellers. That's what the steam is forced through and causes the shaft to turn and then drive the big propellers on the ship. Those impellers are made out of material, a lot of which is going to come from Norway. We'll talk about that in just a little bit. The other place they were competing were in infantry weapons, particularly rapid-firing infantry weapons. The machine gun being first of these. This is a picture of English troops during the Boer War in the 1890s, firing at the Dutch settlers in South Africa. This is actually an artillery weapon, but machine guns and rapid-firing artillery weapons are going to require a lot of raw materials to build. Guess where those raw materials came from? Also, they fired high-explosive artillery shells. This is what made Alfred Nobel so rich, who was Swedish. The materials used to make those shells explosive came out of his fabrics, his factories. Also, the other part of the arms race is that we're going to build up the train network to move those troops around Europe. And trains also require a lot of materials. We know that the rails for trains require a lot of very high-grade steel. Additionally, the telegraph and telephone connections are going to be used to coordinate the movement of those trains and troops. And the telegraph companies really expand, and telephone companies really expand prior to World War I. This map is from 1905, and you can see the huge concentration of telegraph and telephone lines along what will become the front in World War I. We start to see a lot of cars and trucks appearing during World War I. We see the first tanks appear during World War I. Importantly for industries here in Sørlandet, we see airplanes starting to appear in World War I, and lighter-than-air aircraft appearing in World War I. This one was built by the Germans, the Graf Zeppelin. Additionally, this is the first time since the Napoleonic Wars that we've seen huge armies deployed by these countries. Now, look at that picture. There are about 1,000 troops in that picture. Each of them has a uniform. Each of those uniforms is made out of wool. And where does a lot of wool get produced in a textile industry in a Scandinavian country? Could it be Norway? Yes, it could. A lot of the wool used in all the uniforms for all these armies came from Norwegian factories. As a result of the buildup of this huge armament industry during this arms race, Norwegian industry really expands. From the beginning in the 1890s until the beginning of the war, Norwegian industry is going to grow tremendously. Here in the south, we know that Sam Ida, who was from Arendal, is going to found a company called Elkem, and Elkem made their first products were aluminum. They refined the aluminum here in the south because we had cheap hydroelectricity. That aluminum is going to go into the frames of all those airplanes and all those Zeppelins, and some parts of those dreadnoughts are going to be made out of aluminum. The mess kits that each of those soldiers carried was made out of aluminum, and that had to come from somewhere, and the closest source was Norwegian aluminum. Here in Kristiansand, we know Falconbridge begins production of nickel in 1910. The impellers and those steam turbine engines were in part made out of nickel, and part of that nickel probably came from Falconbridge here in Kristiansand. The war breaks out in August of 1914, and it's going to really start to upset the markets that Norway had been developing and depended upon. But already in 1905, in order to protect those markets, right after independence, Norway had declared themselves to be neutral. They could see that the war was coming. Everyone could see that there was going to be a general European war. And Norway already in 1905 1905 had declared their own neutrality. In 1907, they go to the Hague Peace Conference in Amsterdam, and in that peace conference, the great powers, all the great powers, Germany, France, England, Russia, Italy, they all sign an agreement that recognizes Norwegian neutrality. In 1914, the three kings of Norway, Denmark, and Sweden meet in Malmö, Sweden, and declare Scandinavian neutrality. So they are trying desperately to stay out of the war because Norway was industrialized and prosperous in 1914. I think this is an interesting can of sardines that were made in Haugesund, Dreadnought brand sardines, smoked Norwegian sardines in olive oil, just one of the products that they were trading with the Europeans. 2.5 million Norwegians in 1914. Two-thirds of them live in urban areas. So beginning in the 1900s, we start to see the first, this is a totally urbanized, not totally, but this is a largely urban industrial population, which is a big change for the Norwegians. Another part of the story is that foreign banks had financed Norwegian industry. Foreign money had flowed into Norway to help build up, not just, this is the Bank of England in this picture, but also money came from Germany. They invested heavily here in Norway to get the raw materials. And World War I is going to have a fairly bad effect on foreign investment here. Anyway. Part of that investment had helped build the Norwegian merchant fleet, had grown to 2.5 million tons of shipping. This is the fleet that took the raw materials from Norway and delivered them to the continental powers and then brought back the manufactured goods and food that was consumed here in Norway. Again, the war breaks out in August of 1914, and the very first thing that happens is the British blockade the North Sea to keep shipping away from the Central Powers so that they couldn't supply their war machine. That is going to really interrupt Norwegian markets that they were used to dealing with. They're not going to, this is analogous, it's not exactly to what happened during the Napoleonic Wars, but it's very similar. If we remember what happened then during the Napoleonic Wars, and something similar happens then, the British blockade led to very high prices and rationing in Norway. They couldn't get the grains to make bread into the country. The Norwegians couldn't get their raw materials out to get more to trade. And the English were desperately short on food themselves. So this leads to, for the first time in Norway, rationing of bread and meat and sugar and coffee and chocolate here. And that does not make for a very happy population. Very unhappy population starts to organize. That organization starts to split particularly in the workers' parties. We start to see a split of people who move to the left, the communist side, and we see that people that move to the right, to the nationalist side. So this is the beginning of a big split in the Norwegian political world, largely due to these high prices. We'll have more about that in the next lesson. Not all Norwegians could remain neutral. A lot of them had very strong feelings about who should win the war. 15 to 16,000 Norwegians are directly involved in the war on both sides. Some fought for the Germans, some fought for the Allies. This is a picture of a boy from Oslo, from Christiania, who was killed in France during the war. Interestingly enough, he's wearing a Dutch uniform. But most of the Norwegians who were involved directly in the war worked in hospitals as doctors and nurses on the front. And again, on both sides, there were Norwegian doctors in French hospitals, and there were Norwegian doctors in German hospitals. So they are involved on both sides of the war. The merchant marine had 2.5 million tons of shipping before the war starts. 50% of that is destroyed during the war. And most of it is destroyed after 1917, when the Germans declare unlimited submarine warfare on Allied shipping. And because the Norwegians were shipping to the Allies, to the English, their ships were targeted by German U-boats, submarines. So that's going to have a huge effect on the ability of the Norwegians to trade after the war. Just remember that 50% of their fleet is destroyed during the war. Well, that's a very quick look at Germany during World War I. Norway remained neutral during the war. It suffered very high prices. We start to see the start of the political split that's going to become important in the 1920s, 30s, and up to World War II. We're going to see rebuilding after the war because the merchant fleet is destroyed. So neutrality worked in part for Norway, but in part it did not work out very well. And that's part of the story for the next lesson. So thank you very much.